Good morning. My name is Rick Schwark. I'm President and CEO of Absolute Energy. It's my honor to introduce Mr. Jeff Cooper. Jeff Cooper is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Renewable Fuels Association, the ethanol industry's leading national trade association. RFA's mission is to expand worldwide demand for U.S. ethanol and co-products. Previously, he's been serving as CEO since 2018. Previously, Jeff served as a captain in the U.S. Army, specializing in bulk petroleum supply and logistics. Jeff grew up on a farm and ranch in central Wyoming. He earned his bachelor's degree from Drake University and a master's degree from Webster University. Jeff?
Thanks, Rick. Appreciate that. Well, thank you very much, Rick, and good morning, everyone. Great to be with you here in sunny, warm Des Moines this year. I believe the last time I spoke at the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association Summit was 2020. We were out at Prairie Meadows, and I think it was 5 below was the high that day, and we might have had an ice storm or snow or something. So, Monty, I'm not sure what strings you pulled, but I like the way today is shaping up a heck of a lot better than last time I took to the stage. Obviously a lot has changed in those 3 years. When I spoke in January 2020, nobody knew it at the time, but we were really just a couple of months away from the bottom falling out and COVID really upending the global economy. And obviously, we know how the world has changed in the wake of COVID. And a lot has really changed just in the last year. And I was actually at this event last year. I didn't speak, but I spent a lot of time in the trade show and in the hallways. And these were the questions that folks were asking me and asking each other last year at this event. There was still a lot of discussion about whether ethanol production would ever recover to pre-COVID levels, and would we see demand rise back to the levels that we saw prior to COVID? What was going to happen with the renewable fuel standard in 2022 and beyond? You might remember we had a proposal out from EPA at this time last year for the 2022 volumes, but beyond that, 2023 and beyond, really nobody knew what EPA had up its sleeve. Will E15 sales be allowed year-round in 2022 and beyond? You remember that was the big discussion last year at this time, and you just heard Governor Reynolds and Monty and Al speak earlier about the fact that, yes, we did somehow accomplish year-round E15 sales last year as well. There was a lot of talk about, will there be an opportunity for federal clean fuels legislation? There was a bill that had recently gone through the House called the Build Back Better Act. It had a lot of incentives and grant programs in it aimed at clean energy, and yes, renewable fuels were included in that. But it wasn't clear at all how that bill was going to move forward in Congress. Would it get through the Senate? What changes might be made to it? And then finally, and this is a question I think a lot of us are still asking each other, is there a place in the Biden administration's clean energy agenda for ethanol and liquid renewable fuels? And we did gain some insight into that over the past year, but like I said, it does remain partially an open question. I'm happy to say we did get answers to a lot of these questions over the past year. As you heard from speakers earlier today, 2022 was really an excellent year for the ethanol industry. I know it was a great year in Iowa. You heard about the accomplishments in this state. But overall, nationwide, 2022 was really a good year for the industry because we got favorable answers to a lot of these questions. And so I'm going to dive a little deeper into some of these questions and review kind of where we ended up in 2022. In terms of supply and demand, here's a look at U.S. production of ethanol and demand last year. And you can see pretty quickly that no, we did not return to pre-COVID levels of output or demand in 2022, but we are continuing to move in the right direction. I think, we're at 15.9, 16 billion gallons in that range before COVID hit, and production was about 15.4 billion gallons in 2022. So that was up about 400 million gallons from 2021, but still short of where we were prior to COVID. When you look at the demand side, on the right side of this slide, what you see is domestic consumption in 2022 was about the same as it was in 2021, right around 14 billion gallons, but we did pick up a couple hundred million gallons in increased export demand, about a 17% increase in export demand, in fact. So we are moving in the right direction, but we're still short of where we were prior to COVID. And here's the reason for that. If it feels like recovery in the ethanol industry has been tough, if it feels like it's been challenging, here's why. Gasoline demand has been pretty soft. And in fact, in 2022, we actually saw lower gasoline consumption than we saw in 2021. And you can see that we're still only about halfway recovered from the losses we experienced during COVID. We're down about 8.5 or 9 billion gallons of gasoline consumption annually. And if you think about that as being E10, that's 800, 900 million gallons of ethanol consumption that disappeared between 2018, 2019, and the last few years. The silver lining, or the good news, however, is that ethanol is gaining an increasing share of the gasoline that's consumed in the U.S. And that's what the chart on the right shows. We are expecting an all-time record ethanol blend rate, or ethanol inclusion rate, in 2022 when those final numbers come out, of right around 10.4%. So again, we're moving in the right direction there. As more E15 becomes available, as we're seeing growth in E85, that blend rate does continue to incrementally increase. And you might say, well, gosh, the difference between 10.34% and 10.4% is probably not that much, but take that across 135 billion gallons of gasoline, and that's about 100 million gallons of ethanol. That was new demand created just because of that increase in the blend rate. So turning to the renewable fuel standard, and again, there was a lot of uncertainty at this time last year about where we headed with the RFS. And we did have a proposal out from EPA that looked pretty good, but until everything is finalized, you're not exactly sure what you're going to get from the agency. But we did in June see EPA finalize what we believed was a very favorable RFS requirement for 2022 for the ethanol industry. It finally required 15 billion gallons of conventional renewable fuels like ethanol in 2022. And of course, that's the volume, that 15 billion gallon number, that Congress wrote into the law back in 2007. It had never been implemented or fully enforced by EPA until 2022. They also restored 250 million gallons of renewable fuel blending requirements that had been illegally waived by the Obama administration all the way back in 2016. And you might remember we took EPA to court over that waiver, that illegal abuse of their waiver authority, and got a favorable court decision in 2017. But it took until last year, 5 years later, for EPA to finally restore half of that volume that had been illegally waived in 2016. The other big thing that EPA did and finalized last year was a complete denial of all of those pending small refinery exemption petitions. And I'm sure if you've been following the RFS and following this industry for very long, you know that under the Trump administration, those small refinery exemptions took a huge bite out of the RFS, to the tune of several billion gallons of RFS blending requirements that were erased because the Trump EPA was letting small refiners out of their RFS obligations. EPA put a stop to that last year, and that's been a huge benefit for the industry. They also kind of quietly implemented provisions that would make it easier for new and emerging biofuels to participate in the RFS program. You've been hearing a lot about sustainable aviation fuels. Well, unfortunately, the way the RFS had been structured prior to last year, it was difficult to take, say, undenatured ethanol and use it as a feedstock for sustainable aviation fuel and allow that final fuel to generate RINs and participate in the RFS program. EPA fixed that with its rule last year. So as a whole, we really looked at last year's package as very favorable for the industry, putting us on a solid foundation for future growth. But then we turn to the so-called set rule and what happens to the RFS after 2022. And you all know that this has been a debate and discussion that's been going on for years. What you see on the screen there is a page right out of the law that shows when Congress passed this law in 2007, it clearly established volumetric requirements through calendar year 2022. And then after that, it's just kind of up to EPA. And in fact, the oil industry would have told you several years ago, oh, the RFS just ends in 2022. We don't have to worry about it after that. Once we disavowed them and everyone else of that falsehood, we've been working with EPA the last several years to make sure that when it came out with its rules of the road for the RFS post-2022, that it would be favorable and continue to grow the program. And as I said, EPA really has a lot of discretion and latitude to set the RFS volumes after 2022 because, again, they don't have specific direction from Congress for those years. So we've been advocating for at least 3 years, probably longer than that, with EPA to make sure that when they set the RFS volumes for 2023 and beyond, that it continues to grow. That was always Congress's intent with the Renewable Fuel Standard, to continue to grow production and use of renewable fuels. So EPA finally did release its proposal for what they call the set rule in December, so a little bit before Christmas. And again, we liked what we saw in that proposed rule, and it's still a proposed rule. It hasn't yet been finalized. One of the things we liked is they gave us 3 years of standards at once. They've never done that before. Usually, it's been every year EPA goes through this rulemaking process, proposal, final rule, comment periods, hearings. This time around they said, hey, look, we have more discretion and flexibility, so we're going to give you 3 years of standards all at once. That helps everybody when it comes to certainty and planning ahead. For conventional renewable fuels like corn ethanol, they gave us a 15 billion gallon requirement for 2023 and restored the other half of that illegally waived volume from 2016. And then they increased the volume of conventional renewable fuel to 15.25 billion gallons for 2024 and 2025. And you might remember there's probably, you've probably heard in the past that, 15 billion gallons is the cap. Corn ethanol can never do more than that. EPA didn't read the statute that way. We'd been telling them for years that no, there is no cap. You've got the ability and the authority to go above that, and that's what they did in this proposal. Now, I know you're going to hear from the biodiesel folks this afternoon, and certainly we've heard concern from them about the advanced biofuel volumes and biomass-based diesel volumes in this proposal. It's generally thought that the volumes that EPA is proposing are actually below where that industry expects to be in terms of production and certainly capacity in the next few years. So if there is work to do in this proposal, it's to get those advanced and biodiesel volumes a little bit higher in the final rule. This proposal also adds, for the first time ever, the ability for electricity to participate in the renewable fuel standard. So if you've got electricity that comes from renewable biomass or biogas, EPA says if that's being used in an electric vehicle, it can qualify for RIN generation under the renewable fuel standard. And we're going to get into the details of this a little more this afternoon, so I won't go into the weeds now, but all I will say is the proposal they have around these so-called eRINs is quite convoluted and a little bit confusing, and there's certainly room for mischief, we believe, as we look at that proposal. We're expecting these final regulations in June, and so again, we're in the middle of a comment period and believe that we have work to do and some room for improvement in that final rule. Looking at E15, again, this time last year, we were asking ourselves the same question that we asked this year, which is, are retailers going to be able to sell E15 through the summer months? Are retailers going to have the ability to sell E15 year-round? Thanks to our buddies in the oil industry who sued EPA, that year-round availability of E15 was taken away from us by a federal court decision in July of 2021. Now, EPA allowed retailers to continue selling E15 through that summer, but look, at this time last year, we were all wondering, are we going to be able to sell E15 in the summer of 2022? That question was answered pretty quickly in the spring of 2022 when global energy markets just went into turmoil. They were turned upside down by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You'll remember that the U.S. banned petroleum imports of Russia, and guess what? We got about 8% of our imports came from Russia, so that put a hole in our supply. At the same time, we were seeing exports of petroleum products surging from this country because the U.S. was helping shore up softness or holes in global demand in other countries that typically imported from Russia. So that put a real squeeze on U.S. supplies, and as a result, you saw record high gas prices. You probably remember there was a week last year where the national average retail gasoline price for regular unleaded was above $5 a gallon. So all of those dynamics, and with the help of Governor Reynolds and other champions in our industry who were weighing in with the Biden administration, the White House issued emergency waivers allowing E15 to be sold throughout the summer last year as a way of helping to put downward pressure on gas prices. Ethanol was trading for about $1 a gallon less than gasoline blend stock through those critical summer months last year, so it was absolutely helping reduce prices, and you can see some evidence of that just from this picture from a come-and-go station. And so here's what happened with E15 sales because of those emergency waivers. So you look at that green circle, we saw record E15 sales volumes last year, off the charts almost in some locations. There for a few months during the summer, we were selling close to 100 million gallons a month nationwide of E15. Again, that was all facilitated by those emergency waivers. You look back to where those yellow bars are, that's when we had this summertime restriction in place on E15, and that's when sales fall by about 50%. So fortunately, that's not what happened last year. We saw an increase in E15 sales throughout the summer. Now, as you heard from Monty and others this morning, we're in the same boat this year. What are we going to do about E15 this summer? You heard Governor Reynolds talk about the solution that she's put on the table, and we are actively pushing EPA and the White House to make that fix before the summer months come around. There's also a legislative opportunity, we believe, to solve this once and for all nationwide in Congress. Again, we talked about will there be an opportunity for clean fuels legislation, and the short answer was yes. That Build Back Better bill went to the Senate. It got a name change. It became the Inflation Reduction Act, and it did end up passing out of both chambers in August of 2022. There were some changes made, some masterful negotiating by Senator Manchin from West Virginia. He was kind of the linchpin on this whole thing. It would not have happened if not for his vote and his involvement in crafting this legislation. We were successful in getting a lot of clean energy provisions into that final package that will be of huge benefit to ethanol producers if implemented correctly. One of those is the Clean Fuel Producer Tax Credit, which basically pays a tax credit to a producer of any clean fuel that reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 50% or more compared to petroleum. So again, that's where life cycle analysis and the modeling comes into play, and it's got to be done right. But we certainly believe that's going to be a big opportunity for ethanol producers. The Sustainable Aviation Fuel Tax Credit up to $1.75 a gallon. Enhanced and extended carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration tax credits. $500 million for biofuels infrastructure that you heard Monty reference earlier. That was all in this package, and we look at this bill. Of course, all the headlines on the Inflation Reduction Act was, well, thousands more IRS agents and trillions of dollars in new spending, and whatever you think of all that, there's some great stuff in that package for biofuels. It is a game-changing piece of legislation for our industry. We look at it as probably the single largest commitment to biofuels from Congress since 2007 with the RFS2. The other thing Senator Manchin negotiated quite adeptly was, hey, if we're going to give a tax credit for EVs and all this money for electric vehicles, I want to make sure that these vehicles are being built in the United States with materials that are coming from the U.S. And so he put in some thresholds, some requirements that the minerals in the batteries, a certain share needs to come from the U.S., and these vehicles need to be assembled in the U.S. if they're going to qualify for this tax credit. Now we're hearing Treasury is already getting kind of clever about working around some of that. but he had the foresight to put that in there. Obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act was a big piece of the Biden administration's clean energy and climate agenda. And again, we've been asking ourselves for a couple of years, where do we fit in that whole puzzle? Where does ethanol fit? We don't hear the president say a lot about renewable fuels. Here's a kind of the high-level view of President Biden's priorities when it comes to climate policy. He's calling for a 50% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. And that's economy-wide, not just transportation, not just energy production, that's economy-wide. They are going after the transportation and energy sectors first for reductions because that's where the bulk of greenhouse gas emissions come from in this country. And so President Biden has been very vocal, very outspoken about his belief that, we got to get more zero emissions vehicles out on the road to really reduce emissions from the transportation sector. So you might ask, well, what is a zero emissions vehicle? And according to President Biden, it's pretty clear that when he says ZEV, or zero emissions vehicle, in his mind he's talking about a battery electric vehicle. We have a strong disagreement with that. There's no such thing as a zero emissions vehicle. Yes, there may not be any emissions coming out the tailpipe because there is no tailpipe on a Tesla, but there are certainly emissions related to the production of the electricity that is powering that vehicle. There's emissions related to the extraction of the minerals that are in that battery. But overall, when we hear this administration talking about zero emissions vehicle and low carbon transportation, they're typically referring to EVs. So where does ethanol fit in? And clearly, this administration is very focused on electric vehicles from the Department of Energy on down. This is what you hear them talk about. But I will remind everyone that the actions of this administration have been quietly supportive of ethanol and other renewable fuels. We talked about the RFS work that they've done, the denial of all those small refinery exemptions, the emergency waivers on E15, the Inflation Reduction Act inclusion of biofuels, the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Grant Challenge that the agencies have launched. And then DOE and USDA have actually distributed more grant assistance and grant funding to the industry in the last 2 years than we saw under the entire 4 years of the Trump administration. So our message to the administration has been, hey, you're doing a good job on renewable fuels, but guess what? We can do so much more. We can do more. It's not right that you're putting all of your eggs in the electric vehicle basket, and it's not smart to put all of your eggs in that basket. Yes, there are more EVs coming, but we just came off a year where we had record sales of electric vehicles, right? About 8% of all new vehicles sold were electric vehicles. That still puts us at just 1% of all of the 280 million vehicles on the road today having electric, battery electric or plug-in hybrid electric drivetrains. So if you look at some of the projections, there's a lot of experts, some of them self-proclaimed experts, that say by 2030, a third of our vehicles, our new vehicle sales, will be EVs. If that's true, that still means that only about 7 or 8% of the total fleet will be electric vehicles. We also know that this shift would require massive investment and expansion in charging infrastructure, massive investment and expansion in mining of the minerals and rare earth materials that go into these batteries. The other thing that we've been witnessing over the last 6 months or year is that consumer attitudes around EVs are also changing and evolving, and it seems like the shine from the bright, shiny object is wearing off a little bit as consumers are recognizing some of the limitations of these vehicles. So our message again is that ethanol is low carbon too. Let us help in the move to decarbonize transportation. We're already producing fuel that is reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% compared to gasoline. That's a great start, 50%. And many of you, most of you, I would suggest, are probably also producing cellulosic ethanol at your facilities from corn kernel fiber, the cellulose that's in the corn kernel. That's offering about a 70 to 80% greenhouse gas reduction today. And guess what? There's about 200, 300 million gallons of that product in the marketplace today in California that's been certified with that low CI score by CARB. We know that by 2030, we're going to be averaging greater reductions. 70% is what our board has committed to. And our board has also pledged that they will, by 2050, be producing ethanol that has net zero emissions on a life cycle basis. As you heard from Monty, carbon capture and sequestration is going to be vital to us being able to achieve these sorts of aggressive goals. That is the single biggest step that producers can take to reduce their CI scores. So I just want to show this up before I end here, and I think this just really punctuates the missed opportunity that we're seeing from this administration when it comes to biofuels. This table just compares the life cycle carbon emissions for a flex fuel vehicle that is running on E85, and I've got two forms of E85, one made from corn kernel fiber, ethanol, and renewable naphtha, which is a co-product of the renewable diesel process. That fuel can have a CI score as low as 22 grams per megajoule. What does that mean? Well, it means about an 80% reduction compared to gasoline. And when you look at the fossil fuel content of that fuel, it's less than 2%. It's just that little bit of denaturant that's in the denatured ethanol. What's the incremental cost for that vehicle? Well, the automakers tell us it costs us an extra $100, $150 to build a flex fuel vehicle. Historically, they have not passed that cost on to consumers. There's 23 million FFVs on the road in the fleet today that could be using this fuel that is reducing carbon emissions by 80% compared to gasoline. So you go down this table, you look at some of the battery electric vehicle options. Even an electric vehicle using the clean electricity in California doesn't have a CI score as good as that E85 that I talked about coming from corn kernel fiber. It's also got a very high fossil fuel content. And if you're in Missouri, the last line on there, where I live in St. Louis, if you're driving an EV, you're 83% powered by fossil fuels, because guess what? Missouri grid electricity comes from coal and natural gas primarily. So if the goal is to get off of fossil fuels and to lower carbon emissions at the same time, we really need to look at some of the other options that are available out there, especially when it comes to cost to consumers. You look at, my son was looking for new cars. We went to the dealership, and this guy was trying to sell us on a Hyundai Kona. And it was, $23,000, I think, for a new vehicle. And he said, and guess what? You can get this same model with a battery electric option for $37,000. It's like $14,000 more for the EV option. No, we'll take a pass. So, again, I think as I close out here and we look at where is the Biden administration on biofuels and ethanol specifically as part of its vision, they just recently published what they're calling a National Blueprint for Transportation Decarbonization. And it's a 90-page report, and it's all the agencies involved. And you can really distill it down into this one table that's in the report there. And it shows their view of, the relative merits of different technologies for decarbonizing transportation. And that top line there, they say for light-duty vehicles, cars and pickups and vans, SUVs, battery electric is the way to go. And for liquid fuels, renewable fuels, well, to be determined. And we saw that, and I thought, are you kidding me? TBD? We have already shown over the past 40 years that ethanol and biodiesel, renewable diesel can significantly reduce carbon emissions from light-duty transportation. So that was the cynic in me. The silver lining there, I think, is that, hey, with this administration, the door is still open. They haven't closed the door. They haven't fully made up their mind on what role liquid renewable fuels like ethanol can play moving forward. I would also quickly point out that they see a huge role for ethanol and other renewable liquids in aviation and maritime and some of these other sectors. So I'm going to finish with just our to-do list for 2023. We're starting a new year out. As I said, we had a lot of unanswered questions at this time last year. We still have some unanswered questions, but these are the things we're going to be advocating for at the RFA as this year begins. Getting those final rules out for the RFS for 2023 through 2025. Securing year-round E15 for this summer and well beyond. And I know we're going to talk more about the pathways for doing that later today. Timely and workable implementation of all those tax credit programs under the Inflation Reduction Act. And then finally, ensuring that this administration and Congress, finally recognize and acknowledge the carbon benefits of ethanol. And whether that's the next round of light-duty vehicle standards, or whether that's the next round of RFS standards, or whether that's new legislation that's being considered on the Hill, job one for us is going to be continuing to convey to policymakers that ethanol is a solution that is available here and now at a low cost that can significantly decarbonize transportation fuels. So with that, I appreciate the time this morning and look forward to chatting more with you later today. Thank you.